Thelonious Monk was an American composer and jazz pianist. He contributed many pieces to the mainstream jazz canon, such as Round Midnight, Blue Monk, Straight No Chaser, Ruby My Dear, In Walked Bud, and Well You Needn't, and he had a distinctive improvisational approach. After Duke Ellington, Monk is the second most recorded jazz composer. He had a net worth of $1.5 million at the time of death. Using flat ninths, flat fifths and unexpected chromatic notes together, low bass notes and stride, and fast whole tone runs, Monk's compositions and improvisations combine a highly percussive attack with abrupt, dramatic use of switched key releases, silences and hesitations. Monk's distinctive style featured sunglasses, hats and outfits. During performances, he also had a peculiar tendency of pausing while other musicians carried on, getting up and before going back to the piano, dancing for a little while. 5 jazz musicians, Louis Armstrong, Dave Brubeck, Duke Ellington and Wynton Marsalis, have appeared on the cover of Time, including Monk. Awards and accolades. He received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1993. In 1986, Maria Fisher and the Monk family founded the Thelonious Monk Institute of Jazz. In 2009, Monk received an induction into the North Carolina Music Hall of Fame. Early life. Son of Thelonious or Thelius and Barbara Monk, Thelonious Monk was born in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, on October 10, 1917. 2 years prior, his sister Marion had been born. His middle name, which was derived from his maternal grandfather, Sphere Batts, was not listed on his birth certificate, which spelled his first name as Thelonious. January 1920 saw the birth of his brother, Thomas. The family relocated to the Phipps houses, located at 243 West 63rd Street in Manhattan, New York City, in 1922. The neighborhood was known as San Juan Hill due to the large number of African-American veterans of the Spanish-American War who lived there. However, urban renewal forced out the neighborhood's longtime residents, who saw the Amsterdam housing projects and Lincoln Center, but the Phipps houses were still part of the performing arts. Before moving to the piano at the age of 9, Monk briefly studied the trumpet. He had instruction from Alberta Simmons, a neighbor, who taught him in the stride style of U.B. Blake, James P. Johnson, and Fats Waller. He was also taught to play certain hymns by Monk's mother, and he occasionally joined her in singing at church. He did not complete his education at Stuyvesant High School, a public institution for talented kids. Monk spent 2 years learning classical piano under Simon Wolf, a violinist and pianist of Austrian descent who had previously studied under New York Philharmonic concertmaster Alfred Megerlin. Chopin and Rachmaninoff were Monk's favorite composers, but he also learned to perform works by Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and Liszt. The lessons were abandoned when it became apparent that Monk was primarily interested in jazz. Personal life. Thelonious Monk, Lorraine Gordon, at Minton's Playhouse, 1947 to 1952. Lorraine Gordon and her first husband, Alfred Lyon, who was a co-founder of Blue Note Records, were introduced to Monk by Ike Quebec in 1947. Gordon relentlessly evangelized his genius to the jazz community after that. Monk made his first recordings as a leader for Blue Note shortly after he met Gordon and Lyon. These recordings, which were eventually included in Genius of Modern Music, Volume 1, demonstrated his ability to construct fresh melodies for improvisation. Records of Monk Blue Note sessions were made from 1947 to 1952. On December 27, 1949, Monk and Nellie Smith welcomed a son, T.S. Monk, sometimes known as Toot, who went on to become a jazz drummer. Born on September 5, 1953, Barbara, lovingly called Boo Boo, was a daughter who passed away from cancer in 1984. Gordon described the complete lack of interest in Monk's records in her book, which resulted in low sales. When I traveled to Harlem, Monk and I were turned away by those record stores. One proprietor in particular, whose store is still visible on 7th Avenue and 125th Street, will always be in my memory. Why are you up here, lady? He can't play. He is a man with 2 left hands. Just wait, I would advise. You have no idea what a genius this man is. Sales were a secondary concern for Blue Note Records co-owner Alfred Lyon. According to Michael Cascuna, Alfred Lyon informed him that he had to document everything that 3 individuals in his life did because he simply flipped out when he heard them. Monk was the first, followed by Herbie Nichols and Andrew Hill, who didn't give a damn about his earnings or losses. This melody simply had to be recorded. Gordon became Monk's public spokesperson as a result of his hesitancy. She referred to Monk as a genius living here in the heart of New York, whom nobody knows, in a letter to Ralph Ingersoll, editor of the Daily PM, in February 1948. Consequently, one of PM's When top journalists came to interview Monk for a story, Monk refused to talk to the reporter unless Gordon was there. Lorraine got Monk his first engagement at the Village Vanguard in September of that year after approaching Max Gordon, the band's founder and owner. For a week, Monk was on display at the club but nobody showed up there. Monk and his friend Bud Powell were in a parked automobile when New York City police searched it in August 1951. Presumably, Powell's drugs were discovered in the vehicle. The authorities took away Monk's New York City cabaret card because he refused to testify against his pal. In the absence of this, Monk was supposedly prohibited from performing in any establishment in New York that served alcohol. While this severely limited his performance opportunities for years, a group of musicians led by Randy Weston introduced Monk to illegal black-owned bars and clubs in Brooklyn, allowing the pianist to play minimally publicized, one-night shows across the borough somewhat regularly. Monk composed and performed throughout most of the early and mid-1950s at theaters, outer borough clubs and out-of-town venues. 1933 to 1946, early performing career. At 16, Monk formed his first band and played a few school and restaurant engagements. Monk started playing the church organ while touring with an evangelist when he was 17. In his late teens he started getting gigs playing jazz. He served as the house pianist at the Manhattan nightclub Minton's Playhouse in the early to mid-1940s. When Monk played at Minton's he took part in after-hours cutting contests with many of the top jazz soloists of the day, which helped him create a lot of his style, in the Harlem Stride tradition. The development of bebop, which would be expanded upon by Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Christian, Kenny Clarke, Charlie Parker, and eventually Miles Davis, was greatly aided by Monk's musical efforts at Minton's. Monks are thought to be the pianist on recordings that Jerry Newman made at the club sometime about 1941. Afterward, Monk's style was characterized as hard-swinging and included Art Tatum-like runs. James P. Johnson, Duke Ellington, and other early stride pianists were cited as influences by Monk. Thelonious Monk. Straight, No Chaser, a documentary claims that Monk knew Johnson as a teenager and lived in the same New York City area. Monk reported for his Army induction physical in March 1943, but the Army psychiatrist called him a psychiatric reject, and he was not enlisted in the military during World War II. As it was typical at the time for artists to use musical ideas they overheard in their compositions without providing proper credit, Mary Lou Williams, who mentored Monk and his colleagues, remarked on Monk's remarkable inventiveness during this time and how important such creation was for musicians. The Boppers created a song that was difficult to steal. But for the Leaches, I'll say this, they made an effort. I've seen children scrawling on the tablecloth or writing on their shirt cuffs when Minton is busy. Unfortunately, not even our men gave Monk the recognition he deserved. Why, they even appropriated his concept of the bop glasses and beret. Monk and the Coleman Hawkins Quartet recorded their first commercial recordings in 1944. Hawkins was among the first well-known jazz performers to endorse Monk, and the pianist reciprocated by asking Hawkins to accompany him on a 1957 recording with John Coltrane. 1952 to 1954, Prestige Records. Following sporadic Blue Note recording sessions from 1947 to 1952, Monk spent the next 2 years under contract with Prestige Records. He recorded several extremely important, but at the time unappreciated records with Prestige, including joint ventures with drummers Art Blakey and Max Roach and saxophonist Sonny Rollins. The majority of the albums Baggs Groove and Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants were created by Monk at a session on Christmas Eve in 1954. Davis asserted in his autobiography, Miles, that the accusations of blows being exchanged were rumors and a misunderstanding, and that there was no actual tension or hostility between them. Monk visited Paris for the first time in 1954. In addition to playing at concerts, he recorded a solo piano session for French radio, which discs Vogue eventually released as an album. He was introduced to Baroness Panoniken Niket de Koenigswarter, a member of the Rothschild family and a patroness of several jazz musicians in New York City, backstage by Mary Lou Williams. As a close friend for the remainder of Monk's life, she paid Monk's bills, dragged him to an endless array of doctors, put him and his family up in her own home, and when necessary helped Nellie institutionalize him. She also served as a surrogate wife right alongside Monk's equally devoted actual wife, Nellie. The police stopped Monk and the Baroness in 1958 in Delaware. She took the fall for her companion when a tiny amount of marijuana was found, and she even spent a few nights in jail. 1955 to 1961, Riverside Records. Although Monk was well liked by his peers and some reviewers by the time he signed with Riverside, his records continued to sell poorly and his music was still thought to be too difficult for broader popularity. Riverside had successfully purchased out his prior Prestige contract for just $108.24, $1,273.44 in 2024, with Monk's approval. To raise his profile, he voluntarily recorded 2 jazz standards albums, Thelonious Monk Plays Duke Ellington, 1955, and The Unique Thelonious Monk, 1956. Monk mostly played his compositions in the late 1956 recording Brilliant Corners. The final version had to be put together from several takes because the intricate title tune, which featured Rollins, was so challenging to play. The record was, nevertheless, generally considered to be Monk's first commercial hit. Following the restoration of his cabaret card, Monk resumed his career in New York by leading a quartet that included John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Wilbur Ware on bass, and Shadow Wilson on drums during a historic 6-month residency at the Five Spot Cafe in the East Village neighborhood of New York starting in June 1957. Due to contractual issues, Coltrane was then contracted to Prestige, while Monk refused to go back to his previous label. Not much of this group's music was recorded. The quartet's 1957 album Monk's Music included 3 songs from a studio session they did for Riverside, leftovers from a larger group recording with Coltrane and Hawkins, and 3 other songs that weren't released until 1961 on the subsidiary label Jazzland. In 1993, Blue Note released an amateur recording of the Five Spot, a later September 1958 reunion in which Coltrane replaced Johnny Griffin. In 2005, Voice of America engineers recorded a high-fidelity recording of the quartet performing at a Carnegie Hall concert on November 29. This recording was discovered in the Library of Congress's collection and released by Blue Note. After Coltrane left to join Davis's group, the Five Spot tenure came to an end on Christmas 1957, officially ending the band's existence. Only in June 1958, when he started a second tenure at the Five Spot, did Monk assemble another long-term ensemble. This time the quartet consisted of Griffin, after Charlie Rouse, Ahmed Abdul-Malik on bass and Roy Haynes on drums. Monk and de Koenigswarter were arrested by Wilmington, Delaware, police on October 15, 1958, while traveling to Baltimore, Maryland for a week-long performance by the quartet at the Comedy Club. The police thrashed Monk with a blackjack when he refused to cooperate or answer questions. Despite having permission to search the car and discovering drugs in bags stored in the Delaware Superior Court, Judge Christie decided that the illegal detention of the two and Monk's assault made the consent to the search of the Baroness's automobile null and void because it was granted under duress. Columbia Records 1962 to 1970-1964's Thelonious Monk. Monk signed with Columbia Records, one of the 4 major American record labels at the time, in 1962 after protracted negotiations. After 2 European live albums, Monk's relationship with Riverside had degenerated due to arguments over royalties. He hadn't recorded an album for Riverside since April 1960. Working with producer Teo Macero on his Columbia debut, the recordings in the first week of November featured a configuration that had been with him for 2 years: drummer Frankie Dunlop, bassist John Orr and tenor saxophone Rouse, who was a permanent member of Monk from 1959 to 1970. His debut Columbia album, Monk's Dream, came out in 1963. Monk received more promotions than he had at the beginning of his career because of Columbia's resources. His best-selling album during his lifetime was Monk's Dream, and on February 28, 1964, he was featured in the story The Loneliest Monk on the cover of Time magazine. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy caused a delay in the initial November 1963 publication date of the cover piece. Barry Farrell, who wrote the cover story, wanted to write about a jazz musician, and almost by default Monk was chosen, because they thought Ray Charles and Miles Davis were too controversial, wasn't so political, as biographer Kelly explains of the 1964 Time appearance. "I certainly contest that," Kelly wrote. Monk kept recording studio albums, such as Underground in 1968 and Criss Cross in 1963. However, his musical output had diminished by the Columbia years, and only his final Columbia studio album, Underground, contained a significant number of new songs, including Ugly Beauty, which was his only timepiece. Like Riverside, he recorded several live albums during his time with Columbia, including Miles and Monk at Newport, 1963, Live at the Club and Live at the Jazz Workshop, 1964. The latter 2 were recorded in 1964, and the final album wasn't released until 1982. Larry Gales on bass and Ben Riley made up the rest of the rhythm section in Monk's quartet for most of his Columbia tenure after Orr and Dunlop left, both of whom joined in 1964 on drums. They stayed with Monk, his longest-serving ensemble, for more than 4 years, together with Rouse. A 16-year-old girl in charge of planning school dances invited Monk, Gales, Rouse, and Riley to perform at Palo Alto High School in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1968. Palo Alto, 2020, the quartet's last recording, is the outcome of this. 1971 to 1982, later life and death. Due to health issues, Monk had vanished from the public eye by the middle of the 1970s and only made a few appearances in the last 10 years of his life. His final studio recordings as a leader were recorded for the English Black Lion label in November 1971, close to the conclusion of a global tour with the Giants of Jazz, which featured Art Blakey, Gillespie, Kai Winding, Sonny Stitt, and Al McKibben. After playing on Monk's final tour in 1971 and knowing him for more than 20 years, bassist McKibben subsequently stated, "Thelonious Monk, straight, no chaser," 1988, blames Monk's eccentric conduct on mental illness. In the movie, Monk's son claims that his father did not always recognize him and that, due to an unidentified mental ailment that grew worse in the late 1960s, Monk was admitted to the hospital multiple times. Monk would frequently get enthusiastic for 2 or 3 days, then pace for days before withdrawing and ceasing to talk, though no reports or diagnoses were ever made public. Monk's family refused to accept the electroconvulsive therapy that the doctors suggested as a treatment for his sickness. Instead, antipsychotics and lithium were supplied. There are also other theories. According to Leslie Gorse, author of Straight, No Chaser, The Life and Genius of Thelonious Monk, 1997, at least one of Monk's psychiatrists was unable to identify any signs of schizophrenia or manic depression, bipolar illness. According to a different physician, Monk was misdiagnosed and given medication during his hospital stay that may have caused brain damage. Monk spent his final 6 years as a guest in the home of his longtime friend and patron, Panonica de Koenigswarter, in Weehawken, New Jersey, who nursed him throughout his terminal illness. She, together with his wife, Nellie, proved to be a resolute presence, particularly as his life became increasingly isolated. Despite having a piano in his room, Monk did not play it at this time, and he did not converse with many guests. He passed away from a stroke on February 17, 1982, and was laid to rest in Hartsdale, New York's Ferncliff Cemetery, grave 405, Hillcrest 1 section. Rest in peace, legend. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, share it with your family and friends. Comment on the comment section and do give us a like.